Hi, I'm Burke MacDonald with Schaumburg Heartbeat, and we got a great story for you today. We're with Winnie and Chuck Christensen. We're going to talk probably more to Winnie because she was born in China, believe it or not, and I guess we got to start off by finding out how were you born or why were you born in China?
Because my parents were there, and
why
they were missionaries.
They were missionaries?
Yes.
Were they there a long time?
Yes. My father went out in 1902, I think it was.
1902, boy, that is...
But he was married 3 times.
Oh, okay. Even
his
as a
first
missionary?
but married to missionaries, but they died. His first 2 wives died.
We won't ask questions on that.
No, it wasn't his fault.
Okay.
And then he married my mother, and that's when they had me.
Okay, now where were you born in China?
In Xi'an.
Xi'an. Now, what part of China is that? Where
That's
is
sort
that?
of in the middle of China.
In the middle
and
of-
it's best known because in the 1970s they discovered the terracotta warriors there. Somebody was digging and its hole went down through the ground and they found this huge excavation of people. The quick story is the emperor wanted his army buried alive with him
Right.
back in the 2000 period. And the vice president didn't think that was a good idea. Right. So he said, let's make terracotta figures. And they all matched the army.
There was a display of that down at the Field Museum a year or 2 ago, and I went to it, and it's an amazing...
It's phenomenal.
It is.
We were there, and we saw it, you know.
I think we have a
years
shot of that we'll put up, hopefully.
At some point, yeah.
So you went to school then in China. What was it like? Did you learn in Chinese or in English?
I
or?
knew Chinese until I was 6, and then I went to a British boarding school in China, run by missionaries, and so I learned to talk proper English.
Proper English.
And we forgot our Chinese.
So you could have you could have started Mary Poppins. You knew how to speak the right English.
Well, I'm not sure I would do that well today.
Now, what happened? I don't understand why there were Japanese internment camps in China, and that's where you ended up being for a while, right?
Well, Japan invaded China
Okay.
a few years before World War II began.
Okay.
So they had already occupied the coastal areas of China. And so I went to this British boarding school that was run by missionaries on the coast of China. And in a place called Chifu, now it's called Yantai.
Okay.
And so that's why I was in China going to a British boarding school.
Did they just come and pick you up, or how did you end up?
Oh, no, we went by very slow travel. It took a month to go either way back then.
No, I mean to
I'm
get
old,
into the
you know?
but to get into the internment camp, did they come and capture you? Or
No,
what?
what happened was the Japanese had already occupied coastal areas of China because they'd been fighting the Chinese for several years. And then when World War II came, they just marched into our area because we were in Japanese-occupied
Right, okay.
China.
So what was it like? It had to be tough. I mean, what were the conditions like living in an internment camp?
Well, initially they kept us in our own school buildings, but we
Okay.
weren't allowed to go anywhere. And we had to wear big armbands with the initial of our country. And most of the people were British that were in the school, but I had a big A on for American
Okay.
on my arm. And so they kept us there for several months, and then they decided they wanted the buildings. And so then they transferred us to another part of Chifu, or Yantai today.
And then were you put in big like dorms, or what type of housing
Well,
was it?
it had been a mission building and taken over, and they put the girls' school in that particular mission building in a place called Temple Hill.
Okay.
And so we were packed in, over 90 of us, into this.
Did they feed you
building.
very well, or was it not a lot of food, or?
It was, you know, camp food.
Camp food.
It's,
But it's not
it
so
was-
much eating camp food when you're not out on a camp.
But it wasn't nice camp food like we
Right.
have here when we go camping. But we were fed sufficiently. And
Okay.
so that was okay.
Were you allowed to have activities? Like, could you play sports or you read, or what type? What
Well,
would you do? With
we
your
had
time?
sports. We played a lot of leapfrog,
Leapfrog.
going around the building. There were 36 of us that slept on the attic floor, and there was no
36, that's
heat
a
in the
lot.
winter and no air conditioning in the summer. So
Did they provide clothing?
we passed down clothing. We were growing children.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I didn't think of that.
So the oldest ones, had the most difficulty because there was nobody passing down to
To
them.
them.
And so we had to make do with what we had. There wasn't a Walmart or someplace like that to go to buy clothing.
Yeah, I can imagine
So-
it. So in the winter, did they give you heavier blankets, or did they give you coats or anything?
We brought with us to that place where we were interned finally what we could carry. We carried blankets, we carried clothing with us, and we marched across the city to Temple Hill. And that's where the girls' school was confined with teachers, and they taught us. Boy, they
So the
taught us.
teachers were with you, so you did have school while you were
We
there.
had school, but many of the teachers were teaching subjects they'd never taught before because
Okay.
they didn't make sure we had a language teacher and an English teacher.
Right, they just what was there.
We had teachers,
So they
and they
adapted.
taught
Now-
what we needed to learn.
Where were your parents? I assume they weren't in the same. Were they interned?
They
also?
were in the interior. They were in Xi'an.
Were they interned, or were
no.
they? No, they weren't.
They
so-
were under bombing.
Okay, so they had to be really nervous knowing that you
They
were.
were.
They couldn't contact
They
you
had
at
an
all. Right?
11, 12, and almost 13. I turned 13 on my way home.
Were you the oldest or the youngest child in your family?
The youngest.
The youngest.
I had two older sisters who were already in the United States, and they joined the services. One was in the Army, and one was in the
Coast Guard.
Coast
Those
Guard.
were- Okay, so they came
can
back
remember.
to the States as they got older. I mean, it had to be scary as a parent to.
Oh, yeah.
To not know where your child is and what's going on. I just can't imagine that. And you as a child, you obviously want to be with mom and dad.
And they heard horror stories of what went on in concentration camp. And we were a whole bunch of girls with our teachers. And God was good.
Yeah.
And the one thing that was really the foundation for me was my parents had taught me well before I went to school about the Lord.
Well, now, how did you end up hearing that they were going to release you? That had to be quite a day. Do you remember that day?
I remember it. And we were supposed to be then transferred to another camp where we'd pick up more American, 1,500 Americans in internment camps were being exchanged for 1,500 Japanese we had interned over here that we
Okay.
knew nothing about. And so we were exchanged body for body. And so when we heard about it, I had developed a case of mumps. We'd had an epidemic.
And they're doing mumps right now in one of the schools close to here.
We had an epidemic of mumps, and I was the last one to get it. And the teacher said, well, she can't travel. She's got the mumps. And I remember as a 12-year-old girl praying all day, Lord, don't let them care that I've
Right.
got the mumps. And they didn't. They said, put a mask on her, she can go.
She can
you
go.
know? So I did.
There's nothing like heading to the golf course after a long, hard winter, and opening day is finally here. Tee it up at the Schaumburg Park District golf courses, Walnut Greens, and the Schaumburg Golf Club. After you've enjoyed a day in the sun, stop by the newly renovated Chandler's Chop House for a delicious meal. Chandler's Chop House is located at the Schaumburg Golf Club. You can't beat a day of golf and good food. Learn more at parkfun.com.
So they moved you to a ship,
Teamaru.
the Teamaru. Okay.
Teamaru.
But she needs to tell you the story from the prison camp to where they picked up the ship.
Okay, tell me about that.
What? Which story are you thinking
I'm
of?
thinking about the story on the railroad trains.
And
As it turned out,
Yeah.
there were Chinese guerrillas
oh yeah,
in the area that would sabotage tracks. And so consequently, the train that they were placed on had to stop every once in a while because the train at the beginning had, before them, had been sabotaged. So they had to reconstruct the track so that this train could go through. And how many times?
and it happened at least 3 or 4 times.
3 or 4 times it had happened.
And we had been given one little lunch before we left.
That was-
And we had picked up prisoners in other camps, so that there were about 300 on that train. And we were cramped in, and we each had one little lunch. And it ended up being 3 days and 3 nights on that train. So we ran out of lunch, and it was an interesting experience.
I would say that that's more than interesting. I mean, it had to be a very scary situation to be going through.
There was another addition to this, that when you changed trains in Nanking and then left Nanking, what happened?
Well, we got off in Nanking, and then we had to get onto another train, and they said, hurry. So we got on in a matter of minutes, and by this time we were 300 prisoners, and we got on that train real quickly, and we pulled out of Nanking, and Nanking was bombed. And so we just got out in time.
So you get on the ship. So and
Shanghai.
Now you had at least 300 people on this train, as you said, as they were combining people. How many people were on the ship? Do you know?
By the time we'd gone through all the camps where they were picking up people, there were 1,500 of us.
So there were 1,500 on this ship. And what was it like on the ship? Did you have food, and were the conditions better on that ship?
This was the Teamaru, and it was a Japanese ship. And ordinarily in peacetime, they held 600. They had 1,500 of us. All the men and boys were in the hold. And, then we were jammed into staterooms and where they'd put pads around and built a shelf. And it was crowded, and the food was not good. We had rice, and it had worms in it. And some people actually ate the worms for the protein, I couldn't handle it. I remember putting it out on the edges of my plate and eating the rice.
So were you losing weight? When you got off that ship, had you lost some weight? You probably don't know.
I don't remember. I just knew that we were hungry.
You got to a midpoint where they were bringing people from the United States over to this midpoint where you switched ships. And what was the transfer like between the two ships?
Well, it was very interesting. They brought Japanese internees here, and we were a bunch of Americans gathered up from all these camps. And we were a pretty scruffy-looking group.
Well, I would imagine by that point.
By that point. And they were so well-dressed. I remember that. But I do remember at some point when the groups were within distance of each other. It may have been when the ships were parked in the city, in the bay. And we were together in the back of the ship, or it was when we were crossing. At some point, someone began singing a hymn in one of the lines. And
everybody
and then the people on the other line began joining them. And that, to me, was a memorable experience because I turned 13 on that trip. And to think that our countries were fighting each other, we were at war with each other, but here was a group of people
United and being able to sing
in their
together?
faith and singing together. It was a very moving experience in my life.
That's something else. So now you get on another ship that brings you back to the United States,
Yes.
right? And it's called the Gripsholm,
The
I believe.
Gripsholm. It was a Swedish ship.
And what was life like on that ship?
was like going to heaven.
It was that much difference, huh?
It was amazing, you know. They were just so wonderful to us, and the food was fantastic. So the ship's captain came on and he said, "Please go easy. We have a very small infirmary." He didn't want the whole group of now 1,500 people.
Okay, and I assume the
Getting
mumps
sick.
were over by this point, right?
Oh yeah, oh
Okay,
yeah. I
so-
was over the mumps. It was wonderful. We really had food, and that was terrific.
Okay, so did they have entertainment or anything on there, or was it pretty much that you were just?
I don't think so.
Okay,
you know.
so
We
you're
were-
coming into the harbor of New York, and you're actually coming into the Statue of Liberty, right? What was that? That had to be a very emotional.
That was very emotional. Now you have to understand, we were 5 weeks on the Japanese ship,
Right.
and going to India where the exchange took place, and then we got on the Gripsholm there, and then we went the long way around, so we came up into the New York harbor. And it was December, and it was a gray day in December, but we knew we were coming up the Hudson River. And all 1,500 of us, I think, were hanging over the rail and looking for that Statue of Liberty. And we saw it, and I don't think there was a dry eye on that ship.
Well, that-
It was so emotional. And for me, I had turned 13 just before this transition was occurring. And for me as a 13-year-old coming to the United States, it was overwhelming. I was an American. I was free.
And you were home.
And I was home. Even though my parents were still in China, I was going to go to an aunt and uncle that were going to take me in. And it was overwhelming.
When did your parents see you again? Did they?
Not for another year.
Not for another year. That had to be another emotional meeting.
Exactly, because they were in the interior and they were under bombing, and they got out flying over the hump
Okay.
into India.
Okay, we got to give your husband a little bit of time here, and tell me the story about how the two of you met. I heard that she really didn't think you were that cute or whatever when you first met, right?
Well,
I did, though.
it so
That
happened.
was my problem.
It so happened we were in the church on the west side of Chicago,
Okay.
and she was in training at West Suburban Hospital for nursing.
Okay.
And the nurses at that hospital heard that there were some nice young men who were coming out from the city to the west side of this church. So several of the gals decided to go to that church to be encouraged and helped. And when he was invited, and your reaction was?
I'll come, but I won't be one of your silly girls that falls in love with one of those guys.
Well, I noticed this cute little nurse who sat there in the congregation, and at one point she left, and I wondered where she had gone. And she...
I left for a month because I found myself getting very interested in him, and I thought, And I went to another church, and then I thought, I'm over it. I went back, and he was a greeter at the door.
And I said to her, "Where have you been?"
That was it.
That was it. So now you've had
My resolve was gone.
How many children do you have?
Yes, we have 4 living children.
4 children. Oh, and how many? And a lot of grandchildren, I assume.
Oh, yes, 8 grandchildren, and we're looking forward to adding 2 great-grandchildren
Oh,
to
my
our
gosh.
3, so 5 great-grandchildren.
And I heard briefly you were on radio for a while, right?
Yes, I had the privilege of being in broadcasting at Moody Bible Institute. I worked initially in writing and then in production, and I was the manager for 4 years.
Well, hopefully-
And then the school decided to put in a course of communications, so they asked me to transfer out of broadcasting into the faculty, and so I spent 22 years on the faculty also.
Well, that sounds neat. Well, hopefully we did this right here and that you'll approve the way this comes out. I think this is a fascinating story. As I mentioned, last month we did another similar type of story on a gentleman's life. I think it's important for you to get together with your family and find a way to get this oral history so you can pass it on to their children and keep passing it down. Otherwise it gets lost, and I think that's a very important thing. So I really want to thank you guys for coming over today. We appreciate it.
It was a privilege.
We thank you for this. I'm Burke MacDonald with Schaumburg Heartbeat, and don't forget, take time for fun.